Hello and welcome to the Banker's Fresh Perspectives series in association with Deutsche Bank. I'm Joy McKnight, Deputy Editor at The Banker, and I'm joined by Christian Schaefer, Head of Payments Corporate Cash Management at Deutsche Bank, to discuss how the Payment Services Directive 2, or PSD2, is shaping the landscape for the payments industry in Europe and how banks can best respond. Christian, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me here.
So the PSD2 was agreed in 2015, but has until January 2018 to transpose it into national law. What are the market developments so far?
On the regulatory side, we see at the moment the transpositions going on in the member states. So far we have seen final versions in Germany, the UK and the Netherlands. In various other countries we've seen early consultations on the national transpositions. We do already know that for some countries they won't be able to meet the regulatory timeline January 13th by when PSD2 becomes effective, which may raise some challenges for banks. But you also need to consider that PSD2 is not only a regulation which needs to be transposed into national law. There are also a couple of delegated acts by the means of guidelines and technical standards, which are currently drafted and written by the European Banking Association, and that also need to be in place to be rounding up the picture. Here we see that also the policymakers are a bit light.
What challenges are banks facing in order to be ready by the January 2018 deadline?
I think one of the key challenges at the moment is that the guidelines are quite late in the process, and some of them require to be implemented and effected by the banks on the 13th of Jan, which may be a channel if you just wait for the final guideline to be ready. Here the recommendation for banks would be to participate in the consultation process, to see early drafts and accordingly act on those drafts. A second challenge that we see at the moment is that in PSD2 you have a couple of change areas. The most important one is the scope extension of PSD1. That is very clear, that is effective on the 13th of Jan. The other change area is about the opening up of payment infrastructure to so-called third-party providers and the two-factor authentication. The later two depend on one technical standard which is currently discussed, and we expect only in the last quarter of this year, and hence is only effective in 2019, 1.5 years from now. However, related regulatory requirements like providing access about taking liabilities from those transactions is already effective in 2018 in Jan, and there is a time gap that needs to be addressed by banks in order to fulfill requirements, even though the technical standards is not ready yet.
Because that's the whole purpose of the PSD2, really, is to open up the marketplace to third-party providers. How do you see sort of the developments within the interface with third parties?
I think here are two questions. One question is what additional processes need to be in place on the 13th of Jan with the effective date of PSD2. Here, one thing which is important is that transactions that have been initiated by a third-party provider must not be cancelled by a bank upon a request of a payment service user. Here, a procedural change is required. Where it comes to providing dedicated interfaces, as foreseen in the technical standards I've spoken earlier about, that is something which leaves the bank some time for implementation till 2019. However, in order for the whole ecosystem to work, there's a bit more required. One thing which is very key from our point of view is that there is a standard access to the banks by the means of API, which follow the same technical standards. That is something where we at the moment see a few initiatives taking the lead in defining those standards. There is one pan-European initiative, which is the Berlin Group, and they start their consultation process end of October, which will help the market to clearly understand how to build out the interface. The second important thing which is ongoing at the moment is the question about registry. Where do I find a central place where third-party providers as banks are listed so that I know which services are offered by which bank and which third-party provider is eligible in using those. That is something where Preta has taken the lead in developing those services, and we see also them very well progressing.
We've talked a lot about challenges, but what are the opportunities of PSD2 for banks?
The opportunity space is clearly in the new ecosystem that comes from the opening up of the bank interface with regards to the payment initiation and account information services. That is where we see at the first step retail customers perceiving and receiving further value-added services. But we also see a trend of emerging services that may address the needs of corporate customers and the likes.
And maybe my last question is really around how the PSD2 sort of comes together with some of the other regulatory changes that are happening.
I think at the moment there is a strong interlink between PSD2 and the General Data Protection Regime, the GDPR, which kind of interrelate to each other where it comes to consent management and data provision and data confidentiality issues. However, I think PSD2 needs to be seen in the context, and there I believe there are two dimensions that you can look into how PSD2 builds a foundation for further regulatory actions. One of which, what I would call, is in the vertical dimension, is what you can build on top of PSD2, and that comes back to PSD1, which was the legal framework for SEPA, the Single Euro Payment Area. Considering now with PSD2 the scope extension covering all currencies, you could see that PSD2 is the legal basis for SEPA 2.0, which is initiated next year, and hence you could also expect that the Single Euro Payment Area emerges to a Single European Payment Area, where SEPA credit transfer and direct debit might be enhanced in covering further currencies. The second dimension that you can look at is what is in PSD2 that could also be applied to other areas of bank services. And here I would make reference to the third-party interface, where one could imagine that the API-ification of bank services could also be applied in the future to other services in addition to accounts and payments.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your insights, Christian.
Thank you, Joy.